The highest court did not blink. Tonight it delivered a unanimous verdict that sliced straight through government pretense and party spin. 107 pages, clinical relentless, it says public. Money was hidden, it says luxury travel. Was badged as duty. It says the Prime Minister's office diverted millions offshore while the country was told everything was above board. Within minutes of that ruling, Westminster froze trading. Screens flashed, red newsrooms tore up rundowns. This was not political theater. It was a constitutional rupture. A leader who wrapped himself in the language of justice now stands measured by the law he swore to defend. The nation did not watch a scandal. It watched illegal unraveling in real time. The judgment names the figures and traces the roots. It alleges $2.3 million in consulting fees shuttled to Cayman accounts, while officials insisted there was no personal gain. 4 luxury trips logged as policy conferences. To Dubai and Geneva that never existed one donor. Buried behind shell companies, later linked to 80 million unknown emergency contracts. The Chief Justice, read the words without flourish the message. Landed with steel, no one is above the law. What followed was immediate and brutal. Westminster became a battlefield of nerves and loyalties snapping. Security alerts sounded across the estate. Ministers sprinted down paneled corridors to emergency meetings. By early evening, more than 60 MPs had publicly called on the Prime Minister to go. The BBC's headline cut through government paralyzed. Sky News reached for the winter of discontent and said this felt worse online. The reaction detonated. Hashtags rocketed into the tens of millions before the ink was dry. The speaker tried to restore order and was drowned by jeers. Even Labour loyalists waved off cameras, eyes fixed on the floor. Downing Street's iron gates were ringed with angry protesters. Placards rose like a forest. Resign now. Justice for Britain. The mood concentrated into one demand: accountability. By dawn, the paralysis had hardened into panic. Number 10 fell strangely silent. Aides were seen leaving in black cars. Faces drained, clutching boxes like life rafts. A leaked message from a senior staffer was blunt. He's not listening, he's furious. Betting markets went wild. Odds on a snap general election flipped from fantasy to near certainty. Polls showed an astonishing public demand for resignation, yet the Prime Minister stayed silent, and silence in politics is never neutral, it is strategy. Or surrender. Tonight it felt like the latter, and the quiet sounded like confession. When Parliament reconvened, fury filled the chamber like smoke. Opposition benches rammed a senior Conservative, rose and thundered from the dispatch box, fist down. One word ringing: betrayal. Cameras caught every flash of anger, every gasp, every paper. Waved Nigel Farage piled in from the wings, demanding an election before midnight. The Tory front bench cheered it on. Labour MPs sat stunned mouths, tight scripts shredded. The Commons stopped looking like a debating hall. It became a courtroom with microphones. Documents were brandished, allegations flew. The Prime Minister's empty green leather seat turned into a symbol, a silence you could point at. Centuries-old conventions sagged under the weight of raw televised rage. Resign. Roared the chamber, a chant rolling over the speaker's pleas. Outside, clips from the debate exploded across feeds, harvesting tens of millions of views in hours. By nightfall, Labour strategists privately conceded the party's prospects were wrecked. For the opposition parties, this wasn't mere gain. It felt like retribution. The court had issued judgment. Parliament was delivering punishment. Across Britain, the public response was volcanic. Tens of thousands poured into central London, Union flags, homemade signs. Fury sharpened into slogans. Corruption ends now. Manchester and Birmingham followed. Crowds snaking for blocks. Police estimates climbed into the hundreds of thousands. And nationwide, within a day, a video of a protester clambering up a lamppost and shouting, "He betrayed us," went stratospheric. In Glasgow, citizens held mock trials, reading extracts from the ruling into megaphones. One placard hit like a gavel: "Justice has spoken. The people will enforce it." The national conversation hardened into historical comparisons. Commentators reached for Watergate political cartoons, showed the Prime Minister sinking beneath the Supreme Court's hammer. The media smelled momentum and surged. Morning papers screamed the same line across front pages. Corruption at number 10. Outlets that once wrote in neutral tones rolled out blistering editorials. Voices across the spectrum demanded answers. This was no longer only about a leader. It was about credibility. Collapsing in plain sight ratings spiked millions. Watch the meltdown live, and then the damage broke out of politics and ran into people's pockets. Markets reacted with fury. Sterling tumbled. Nearly 5%, the steepest drop since the Brexit shock. Global investors dumped British assets. The London Stock Exchange bled billions. In a single session, business groups warned confidence had evaporated. The CBI issued an emergency plea for stability. Foreign embassies drafted contingency plans. Inside labor cracks split wide. 8 shadow ministers tendered resignations. Overnight sighting. Reputational harm that could not be repaired. Leaked memos named potential interim caretakers allies. Abroad issued careful lines about respecting the judiciary, while EU officials began closed-door talks about a post-Brexit Britain. Back in Downing Street, sources described a bunker and panic-kissed. Armor-paced rooms alone. Aides flared so resigned. Phones went unanswered. One staff had told reporters he did not sleep at all. He stared at the door as if expecting a knock from the law. Lawyers were contacted. Office of Representation were told were thin. Rumors of a televised address swirled, then died. Minutes before airtime, the images looked cinematic and damning. Official portraits taken down. Speeches edited and abandoned. Photographs quietly deleted. Once loyal allies scrubbed their feeds. And then the photo that defined the night. Keir Starmer at a Downing Street window, staring at the crowds as the chant hit like waffles. Resign reflected behind him in the glass. Cold, immovable, the Supreme Court. The symbolism was cruel, unmistakable. And yet this story was not done tightening the screws. Markets reeled, but it was nothing compared to the political earthquake that followed. International screens flickered with the pound's collapse and the Prime Minister's photo side by side. Embassies sent urgent cables back to their capitals. The words "constitutional crisis" became the headline phrase. Of the hour, foreign correspondents filled Downing Street pressing against barriers, as though watching a state funeral in slow motion. What had begun as a legal judgment now metastasized into a full-blown crisis of authority. Inside number 10, the mood was bunker dark. Aides spoke in whispers, legal teams rotated in and out. Sources described Starmer as pacing, chain-drinking black coffee, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. Phones rang unanswered. Ministers stopped defending him on air. The sense was not just of a man losing power, but of power itself evaporating. Cabinet cohesion shattered. Half the ministers resigned. The other half acted as if government, continued by muscle memory departments, stalled. Civil servants waited for orders that never came. Westminster, once the heartbeat of British order, now pulsed with confusion outside. London roared. Protest fires flickered against Parliament's stone walls. Smoke hung low over the Thames. Crowds camped through the night in Parliament Square, chanting the same 2 words, "Justice resign," until their voices cracked. Police sirens echoed over Westminster Bridge as mounted units pushed back the surge. Protesters held torches like warning beacons. Some wept. Some sang "Rule Britannia." Through clenched teeth, this was no longer politics. It was retribution, the British public weary of scandal. And excuses had reached its moral limits. By morning, the unrest has spread like a weather front. Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Bristol all echoed with the same chants. Videos swept social media. Streets filled shoulder to shoulder. Faces lit by phone screens. The air electric with disbelief and fury. Tens of millions watched and shared. "This isn't about one man," said a woman into a camera in Leeds. "This is about trust itself." The media smelling history turned carnivorous. Piers Morgan opened his morning show with a blistering line, "Silence is cowardice." Britain deserves better. The Guardian accused Labour of moral rock. The Daily Mail splashed a single brutal headline fall of a fraud even the BBC usually restrained. LED with constitutional crisis. Analysts compared it to Nixon, but worse, because this was Westminster editorial cartoons. Flooded timelines, Starmer sinking beneath. Scales of justice number 10 crushed under the Supreme Court's gavel. Hashtags like "hat end of Labour into justice." Prevails trended across every platform. Then came the economic aftershock. The pound, already wounded, plunged again. Confidence drained from the city, the London Stock Exchange lost nearly $100 billion in 48 hours. Mortgage rates shot above 6%. Pension funds, hemorrhaged cash families terrified, called their banks as lenders froze new deals. Business leaders warned of economic cardiac arrest. Foreign governments reacted with alarm. Washington urged stability. Brussels convened emergency talks. Reports leaked that some embassies had quietly evacuated non-essential staff. Analysts described it as the most dangerous moment for British democracy and living memory. At Westminster, Labour was fracturing by the hour. 8 shadow ministers had already resigned. Dozens more ignored summons to briefings. Leaked internal document showed a list of provisional interim successors, names of MPs who only weeks earlier had been sidelined to backbenches. One of them, speaking off the record to ITV, said coldly, "He's finished, the party's finished. We're just waiting for the body to stop moving." And yet amid the ruin, Keir Starmer remained unseen. No statements, no press conference, no broadcast. He had vanished into the shadows of Downing Street, leaving aides to face the storm. Those close to him described frantic calls to lawyers and sleepless nights in rooms filled with silence. One aide swore he found the Prime Minister pacing alone at 3 and whispering, "They betrayed me." By midweek, Downing Street looked abandoned. Plates of food untouched. Security guards avoiding eye contact. Aides carrying boxes of files into the fog. The seat of power had become a museum exhibit, an address haunted by absence. And then came the photograph that crystallized the collapse. A single shot from across Whitehall, showing Starmer framed by his office window, staring down at the chanting crowd. Behind him, the reflection of the Supreme Court's marble pillars gleamed faintly in the glass. The symbolism was merciless. The man who built his name on the rule of law, now imprisoned by it. Inside the palace, alarm bells rang behind polite smiles. Courtiers briefed the king hourly that the government had ceased to function. Departments paralyzed, spending frozen. Civil servants refusing to authorize orders. A1 insider described the administration as a government that exists only on paper. Rumors of emergency powers swirled. Whispers of constitutional intervention. Yet Charles, true to form, remained silent. For now, by Thursday, Britain's reputation abroad was in freefall. Financial analysts declared sterling uninvestable. International broadcasters called it the British implosion the world watched. Stunned as one of the oldest democracies on earth stumbled to its knees. And still no resignation, no apology, no plan. Just silence and a nation unraveling. Westminster, once the engine of stability, had turned into a theater of humiliation. One veteran MP summed it up as cameras rolled. Britain isn't being governed anymore. It's just bleeding out in slow motion. As midnight fell, the protests reignited. Fires burned again in Parliament Square. The chants were no longer angry, they were cold final. Resolute, the people had made their decision. The government, for all intents, no longer existed. And through the smoke, one question echoed across the nation: the markets. And the very halls of power, who will lead Britain out of the storm, but the storm did not pass, it deepened. What began as a legal reckoning had evolved into a national identity crisis. Britain, the land of quiet institutions and calm continuity, was now staring at the mirror of its own fragility. Analysts called it the reckoning of a generation. And as the silence from number 10 stretched into another day, the whispers of succession grew louder, more desperate, more public. Behind closed doors, rival factions circled. Senior labor figures plotted in private dining rooms, names were floated, tested, discarded. Some spoke of reconciliation, others of revolution. Every hour brought new leaks. Letters of no confidence drafted resignations. Secret meetings in Westminster corridors where cameras couldn't reach journalists began camping outside party headquarters, broadcasting live from pavement slick with rain. The tone had shifted from outrage to disbelief. Britain was adrift, markets already battered. Continued to slide, mortgage rates soared. The pound flatlined. Economists described the crisis as political contagion, a loss of faith spreading faster than any currency correction could contain. Business groups pleaded for clarity leadership. Read one stark open letter from industry heads. Is not optional. The Treasury issued an emergency statement denying rumors of capital flight, but no one believed it. Ordinary families began withdrawing savings. The queues outside banks looked like something out of another century. The streets, though, remained the true barometer. Protests swelled against students, workers, retirees, are all standing shoulder to shoulder in cities that hadn't seen unity like this in decades. The chants grew rhythmic, almost ceremonial. Justice for Britain, the people decide. Drone footage showed London glowing under torchlight. A slow river of humanity moving through Westminster. Police lines bent under the pressure but didn't break. A weary officer muttered, "Two, a reporter, we're holding the line." But not for him anymore. In the studios, pundits spoke with a kind of grim awe. This isn't about left or right, but said one former minister, it's about legitimacy. Across airwaves, a rare consensus took hold. The government had ceased to exist in anything but name. The civil service was operating on autopilot. Departments were leaderless. One permanent secretary was quoted as saying, "We've switched from governance to containment." By now, every rumor mattered. Some said Starmer would resign by dawn. Others said he was preparing a defiant address. But the morning came and there was nothing. No motorcade, no podio, no words. The void itself became news. Anchors filled airtime with speculation, their tones sharpening as patience ran out. The story shifted from scandal to survival. How long can a government function without a head? How long before the Crown intervene? Then came the leaks from within Number 10. Fragments of panic, one aide described. Shredders running non-stop. Another said entire archives were being sealed. The National Archives issued a formal notice, reminding the government of its legal duty to preserve. Records reporters called it the cleanup before the collapse. Every hour brought another resignation. Every hour another statement of profound disappointment. Across the Atlantic, Washington privately urged calm, fearing instability could rattle alliances. Brussels prepared economic contingencies, and in the Commonwealth, quiet concern turned to open criticism. Former allies, once loyal now, spoke of Britain as a warning, a democracy consumed by its own contradictions. The rule of law means little, said one Australian commentator. If the rulers themselves stop obeying it, the mood in Britain turned darker still. Pubs filled with conversations that cut deeper than politics, about trust, about identity, about what Britain had become. There was exhaustion now, but also something more dangerous, clarity. People knew what had happened, and they would not forget. As midnight approached on the 7th day, the clock at Big Ben tolled over a city on edge. The crowd outside Parliament stood silent for the first time in a week. Then from somewhere deep in the mass, a voice shouted, "Who governs us now?" No one answered. Upstairs in a darkened office, a man stared at his reflection in the glass, the echo of chants still ringing through Whitehall. Behind him, the Union Jack hung limp, untouched. The nation he once promised to serve now stood beyond his reach. And for the first time, perhaps, he understood that history had already written him out. The silence stretched heavy and final, as dawn's first light washed over a country, no longer certain of what it was, or who would lead it next.